What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my DLC review for Treasures of the Midnight Isles for Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Owlcat Games was kind enough to provide me early access to this a few days early before its launch today, so I could bring you guys this review. Now, if you already have the Season Pass 1 for Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, you'll be good to go as soon as it launches a bit later today. Otherwise, you can pick up the DLC as a standalone bit of DLC for $12.99, I believe. Now, in addition to the DLC, we should also be seeing patch 1.4 drop today. I'm not really going to be covering that here as I don't have the final patch notes for that at the time of this recording, and we'll likely cover that tomorrow. So for today, we're just covering the DLC and not the patch that should be dropping alongside of it. Let's actually dive into this thing. First things first, this DLC is divided up into two parts, the main campaign version and the roguelite standalone version, which is like the main thing. However, you will be able to play this DLC in the main campaign. Once you reach a certain point in the story, it becomes available. However, it is a modified version, much like we saw with Beneath the Stolen Lands in Pathfinder Kingmaker, which is a very similar DLC concept. The story version of the DLC there as well had a much shortened and condensed version and effectively worked as a very long side quest, basically. And that's essentially what we're seeing repeated here. So in the main story, you will be able to get access things to like the new bosses, new items, etc. It is nonetheless a condensed and slightly altered, to fit the narrative of course, version of the DLC. The roguelite version can be played from the main menu. You start a new game, you pick the DLC, and you roll up your character. However, some things to understand about this is that you only get one save for this DLC because it is a roguelite version. However, death or dying does not actually erase your save or anything. You simply start over with new characters, which I will explain a bit more in just a second. So let's talk about what's actually happening in this DLC. This DLC takes place in the Midnight Isles, which we of course visit in the main game. Moreover, we come into contact with a cursed ship led by a man named the Helmsman, who recruits adventurers to scour the Midnight Isles for treasure as he is looking for something, though he won't say specifically what. Obviously, the story of the DLC kind of revolves around all of that unraveling and coming together, but I will obviously save spoilers for maybe some other time. But I would tell you, if you were paying attention during Act 4 of the main story about what was going on with the Midnight Isles, you could probably guess where this story is going for the most part. But nonetheless, let's actually talk about how a few things are going to work. The roguelite version of this is going to see us moving from island to island in sets of 5. So each phase of the DLC story, if you want to call it that per save file, is going to take place on 5 sets of 5 islands. And while you can see all sorts of islands on the menu here, as you can see there are paths that you have to sail through the Midnight Isles with, meaning that you go to island, and you're effectively going to go to 4 of these islands before you land on the big island on the left side of the screen. Now, the little skulls above each individual island are a difficulty rating for that island. However, this will of course vary a little bit by the actual difficulty you have the game set on. But in general, 1 to 3 skulls, 3 skulls being the hardest. This means you're going to find stronger and more monsters on those islands. And then next to those skulls, we see a little indicator of the reward we get for completing that specific island. These can be things like fresh recruits for roguelite mode, bonuses for our companions during this particular adventure, things like stat bonuses, etc. All very strong buffs, honestly. There's a lot of rewards here, and it was pretty cool to see that. However, once you make your way all the way to the left side of the screen, once you're at sea, by the way, you can't go back to port, which we'll talk in just a second, but you'll have to make your way through these islands and eventually get to the last one on the left. This island is set. The 4 previous levels you'll have gone through are procedurally generated with a kind of different reward. However, the last island in a set of 5, the 5th one, is always a set map. It will end with a boss that is pulled from a tier. So the first set of 5 islands you do will have like one of a couple bosses, so on and so forth. However, once you get to the 5th set of 5 islands for each quest phase for the DLC, you're going to encounter a set boss. Those boss fights are unique and they usually have extra elements specific to them, which I thought was pretty cool. So as you can see, we have a bit of a mix of procedural generation with also some set encounters, which does mean that the loot from the the bosses, which are again kind of pulled from a pool, will be set. So if you kill a specific boss, you're going to get specific loot from that boss, whereas the stuff we see throughout the rest of a dungeon might be a little random. Now, let's talk port, because I mentioned that. Before we set off on our journey of traversing the islands, we will be at the port, which is Alushanira. Here is where we're going to be able to recruit other adventurers, as well as access shops and services. Basically, every time you complete a run of islands, you'll come back here, upgrade your gear, get ready to go again, hop back on the ship, and then continue exploring the islands. However, once you're at sea, you cannot come back to port, because if you try to, in roguelite mode anyway, it will force you to start again with a new set of adventurers because the helmsman won't let you continue exploring, basically. Which brings me to the next section of this review, dying, tailwinds, and undertows. So I wanted to talk about the kind of roguelite elements here. Dying, despite having one save, is not the end of your game. Anytime you either die or decide to just end your adventure by talking to the helmsman and saying you're done, you can start a new adventure and roll new characters. This will allow you to continue. Now, this will basically send you back to the start of the phase of the quest you are in. So the DLC will continue to progress so long as you're making progress on the phases. However, if you reset your adventure, you'll go back to the beginning of the phase that you are on. So every 5 sets of 5, basically, you hit a sort of checkpoint that you start restarting from. And this is how they handle you kind of constantly changing characters, approaches, etc. Now, I mentioned tailwinds and undertows. Tailwinds are a sort of buff for the current party you are working with. You'll have a choice of 3 tailwinds when you start actually getting access to them, essentially after your first run. And tailwinds are a very strong buff to a group that you can then take through this DLC, which adds some sort of randomness and mix-up of the mechanics, which I thought was a nice touch. And then there are the undertows. Once you're actually out at sea and exploring the islands, each island will be subject to an undertow, which is just a basically random effect that will affect that island, and it'll change the way magic is cast, damage is rolled, that type of stuff, which again adds the element of randomness. And then let's talk mythic advancement. So if you're just playing the roguelite mode, you will still get access to mythic levels, though it works obviously a bit differently than it did in the story. Basically on set levels, meaning like the number of islands you're on, I believe the first one is island number 11, you will get access to a Nihindrian crystal. You can give this to the helmsman, which will then give you a mythic rank in a sort of trade-off. That said, all of the mythic paths are unlocked once you hit mythic rank level 3. You can just pick whatever mythic path you want. You don't have to do anything special to unlock anything. You just have the options. Or you can sell that Nihindrian crystal for a ton of wealth, which will allow you to buy more equipment. So you don't even necessarily have to lean into the mythic path stuff if you don't want to. Kind of dealer's choice there. Now, all of this randomly generated stuff, it just gets more and more as you go. We're going to see different undertows, different tailwinds, all these random effects, which honestly make the exploration pretty interesting. And as you might imagine, that also comes up in terms of the monsters you are fighting and the items you are finding. So they did a really cool thing with the monsters, which sees them adding both new monsters and returning monsters from Kingmaker, in addition to the one that we already saw in Wrath of the Righteous. So this sees the return of some of the Fey creatures we fought in Kingmaker, manticores, some of the drakes. We even get new stuff like different variants of actual dragons or unique boss fights that we don't see anywhere else, or like models, that type of thing. So there's a lot of new and returning monsters in addition to the ones we fought pretty often in Wrath of the Righteous. So even here, we do see a lot of variation in the enemies that we've seen up to this point. And naturally, we got a bunch of new loot on top of that. So we can find new magic items on the vendors at port. We can find new magic items in the islands that we're actually exploring. And then, of course, all of the boss enemies I mentioned with set loot do have unique items specific to them that are also new to the game. So there's a lot of unique stuff to see and explore. Once you get to a certain point in the quest, by the way, you get access to a special vendor who can sell you any like unique item you might have missed too, by the way, as you move from group to group. Now, in addition to all that stuff, it wouldn't be an Owlcat DLC if there weren't some secrets involved. There are a few extra side quests as well. There's a sort of pirate map you can put together to go to a special island. There's a secret boss fight or two. So there are some extra things to be explored while you're out exploring. which I thought was a nice touch as well. But that's pretty much all I've got for you guys and the treasures of the Midnight Isles outside of talking, just straight up spoilers. That's pretty much what there is. A lot of new stuff brought to the game, a lot of returning stuff from Kingmaker, and I would tell you all of this combined is going to add probably dozens of hours of game time for a lot of people. I know myself included for sure, especially when we start talking main story editions versus the roguelite mode. I did want to talk about a few other things. I did notice while I was exploring the islands, the actual environments are new. However, they're not very varied at all. After you've run through like 10 or so islands, you've basically seen every environmental area you're going to see, outside of the special like maps where the set bosses are that have a very specific dungeon, if you will, which is like every 25 islands. So environments are a bit repetitious, but the ones you see are actually new, or at least have new effects in them. The other thing is that this is primarily a combat DLC. So if you don't like the combat or you don't like the system, honestly, and are just playing the game for the story, you're probably not going to like this DLC because that's what this DLC is. It's just tons and tons of combat. It's a fantastic place to test out new builds, especially with the iterative nature that you're just kind of starting a new adventure and you can just, kind of throw builds at the wall until you find something you like. But if you're really attached to a specific character and kind of don't want to see that character die over and over again, this DLC is probably not going to do a lot for you. But if you really enjoy the combat and you want to mess around with the builds and you're interested in the story of the Midnight Isles and the helmsman and what's going on with this cursed ship, then I think it's for you. But overall, unsurprisingly, gets a stamp of approval for me, is going to add a ton of gameplay to the game, which I'm excited to go through and round up yet again. All of that said, guys, thank you. Hope you enjoyed this review of the DLC. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.